Brooksville was the kind of town people described with a soft smile, just over 8,000 souls, a main street with a barber whose hands had steadied 3 generations, a diner that still wrote the day's pie flavor on a chalkboard, and porches where men nodded at each other like punctuation. The town sat inland from the coast, its air heavy with orange blossoms and the slow, persistent hum of cicadas. Everyone knew everyone else's cousin, and rumors traveled faster than the mail truck. Dorothy Mae Henderson had lived there since before most of those who now ran the hardware store were born. At 74 she moved like someone wrapped in memory, slow, sure, careful with the small things. Her house was a low bungalow with peeling white paint and a sagging porch swing. In the backyard, beneath a rubber tree and a stubborn patch of lantana, stood a small plaster statue of the Virgin Mary. It had been their wedding anniversary, purchased 32 years ago, bought with coins Dorothy and Harold had saved in a cigar tin. Harold had died 3 decades earlier, and the statue had been Dorothy's way of keeping his memory in the garden where he once knelt to plant seedling after seedling. The summer of 2023 began ordinary and hot, but on June 12, a call came that would cleave Dorothy's life in two. Dorothy's daughter Jennifer and Jennifer's husband, Michael, were killed in a highway crash on I-75 near Gainesville. There were no survivors, the police told Dorothy in words that felt like blunt instruments. They also said there were 2 children, Emma, age 2, and a 4-month-old baby who would be placed elsewhere. Social services came, paperwork rustling like dry leaves, and by evening a mute, frightened child had been delivered to Dorothy's doorstep, a small bundle of clothes and a face that understood catastrophe like it was an old friend. Emma arrived without the noise of toddler protest. She wore a faded pink dress and clutched a rag doll. For days she slept with her mouth slightly open and didn't answer when Dorothy sang the old songs Harold used to whistle. Dr. Patricia Williams, the pediatrician who had known Dorothy since her own children were little, diagnosed trauma, no speech, no eye contact, a child cut off like a light switch. Dorothy tried everything she could think of. Rhymes, warm milk, the radio playing slow country songs, but Emma stayed silent as if words had been taken from her. Then, on June 18, something changed. Dorothy was at the stove making oatmeal when she heard a voice from the backyard, not a child's murmur, not the dry punctuation of birds, but a clear, small voice saying, "Hello, beautiful lady, do you live in this garden?" She dropped the spatula and went to the window. There, sitting with her legs crossed in front of the white plaster figure, was Emma. The child's face was open, her chin lifted, her small hands folded like she was listening to someone older and just beside her. Dorothy walked out into the sun and called, "Emma, who are you talking to?" The girl turned. For the first time since she had arrived, she smiled, a slow, honest break of a smile that made Dorothy's chest feel both hollow and full. "The beautiful lady in the blue dress," Emma said. "Her name is Mary. She will take care of me." The voice, the confidence, the name Harold had used for Dorothy, Nana, hit Dorothy like a freight train. No one had called her that in years. Jennifer called her Ma, Harold had called her and somehow Emma, who had never known Harold, used the nickname like it was a key to unlock something that had been quietly waiting. Over the next days, Emma's visits to the statue multiplied. She would sit for hours, sometimes laughing, sometimes nodding as if Mary were answering. She asked questions about flowers, about why the lilies by the fence were taller than the ones on the neighbor's side, about how the sun felt on a loving hand. Dorothy watched with a mix of fascination and maternal terror, standing at the window with a mug of tea as if some new weather had rolled through her life. Then came the first public ripple. On June 26, Emma ran into the house, eyes bright, breathless like she'd been carrying a secret all the way from the backyard. "Nana. Mary said something super important," she announced, teeth flashing. She told Dorothy, in careful sentences that shocked the older woman into silence, that the woman in the yellow house across the street was very sick and that a tea made from the green leaves by that woman's back fence would help. Dorothy laughed the way you do when you're trying to keep fear out of your voice. "How would a little girl know that?" she asked. Dorothy crossed the street more from a sense of absurd duty than belief. Carmen Rodriguez opened the door, tired and pale. She explained a 3-week spell of exhaustion and stomach pains that left her hollowed out, despite tests and hospital visits. Dorothy, unsure of how to say what had been said to her granddaughter, asked a blunt question, "Do you have medicinal herbs in your yard?" Carmen blinked, then said she did: mint, chamomile, tarragon, a handful of nicknames for old remedies her mother had shown her. Carmen brewed the tea, she took it, she slept, she ate, and 3 days later she came to Dorothy at dawn, eyes clear and full of a light like someone reborn. "I feel like myself again," she said, touching Dorothy's arm. She said she had dreamed of lavender and a warm hand. The story ran down the block like a dropped stone. From there, the town changed shape. Small miracles, meaningful, personal, precise, began to orbit around the backyard. Bobby Martinez, a man who had shut himself off after his wife Sophia's death, burst onto Dorothy's porch in tears to tell her an ecstatic truth. His daughter had called to say she was pregnant. Linda Watson got a long-awaited retirement letter. Mr. Frank O'Connor found his lost wedding ring under a paint can in the garage. A neighbor's cat was diagnosed in time to be saved. After Emma insisted it needed a vet, none of it was spectacular in the way of thunderbolts or saints walking down Main Street. It was intimate and exact, like a carefully placed stitch mending torn cloth. Word spread beyond the street. By the first week of July people came from other towns, Spring Hill, Weeki Wachee, Dade City, to see the child and the statue. Some came out of curiosity, some came out of devotion, some came because hope, once it finds purchase, will not let go of a town. They stood on the sidewalk, sometimes whispering, sometimes bold and loud, cameras in hand or simply clasping rosaries. A few skeptics set up lawn chairs with notepads and polite skepticism. A local news crew arrived with a camera on a tripod, trying to frame the story in tidy sound bites. Dorothy, who had never asked to be anyone's altar or billboard, found herself at the center of attention she did not want. She tried to set rules. Emma would speak only in the morning, only for an hour, and only for a few people at a time. People respected those rules at first. They lined up respectfully, like pilgrims, and sometimes left with pressed hands and watery eyes. Other times the line broke into a press of bodies. People began to camp at the curb, to knock at all hours, to peer over the fence and call out confessions to a little girl who was not trained to carry a town's burdens. The police came twice. Sergeant O'Sullivan was gentle with Dorothy but clear. "Ma'am, there's no law against people praying on the sidewalk," he said. "We can keep things calm, but we can't keep people away if they stand where they're allowed to stand." Dorothy clutched the porch rail until her fingers ached and told him, quietly, "I'm responsible for that child." Inside, Emma remained mostly herself, but the attention changed the shape of sleep. She would sometimes wake in the night crying and whispering a name. Once she told Dorothy, "Mary said some things can't be changed." Dorothy would answer with the only thing she had, a hand to hold and the steady hum of old songs at bedtime. The child's simple faith, and the town's complex hunger, collided in ways Dorothy had not been prepared to manage. Then, one afternoon in mid-July, as the crowd swelled past anything that felt manageable, a man in a suit came to the door. He looked like someone who belonged to the kinds of meetings Dorothy had watched on public television. Clean shoes, a smile sharpened by practice, a binder under his arm. He introduced himself as Rick Castellanos and said he represented an events company. He used the kind of language that makes older people's ears prick. Organize, venue, monetize, 60%. Dorothy listened for a moment and then closed the door. That was the thing about Brooksville. Faith arrived like new weather and people rushed to open windows. Some wanted to kneel, others wanted to measure how many would buy a seat. A dozen voices rose in a single week. Priests and pastors offering prayers, a young woman with a live stream begging for donations, a man from the county wanting to put up a portable stage for better crowd control. People brought candles, pictures, letters written in shaky hand explaining what they hoped for. Some came with demands. A woman with a small boy in a wheelchair began to plead that Mary heal his legs. Emma listened and, as she sometimes did, fell quiet. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin but certain. "Mary said she can't fix everything." The woman screamed and left. Afterward she shouted into the night that the whole thing was a sham, that Dorothy was making it up for attention. Dorothy began to wonder what she had done. She had taken in her granddaughter because there was no one else. She had kept the statue tidy because it had been Harold's last project. She had hummed old hymns and told old stories to a child who needed time. She had not expected to become the keeper of a miracle or the target of 1,000 competing hopes. She had never wanted a business model in the middle of her yard. On the porch one cool evening, while the crowds buzzed thin to the hum of crickets, Dorothy looked at the statue as if it were a person who might answer. She admitted out loud, to the plaster and the night, that she didn't know how to protect the child from the world. She promised herself one thing: she would do everything she could to make Emma a child again. That night she slept for the first time without hearing a knock. But Brooksville does not tend to forget when something remarkable happens on one block. 3 days later, at dawn, Dorothy opened the door to a man she'd never seen before. He had the kind of smile that spoke of opportunity. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "we can help you make sure this is done right." The county had already had too many conversations about tents and traffic. Somewhere, the sound of a camera was being loaded into a van. Dorothy's hand tightened on the doorframe. She had wanted only to give Emma a safe place. Instead, the town's curiosity had become a current, and now that current had brought strangers to her porch with plans and promises. Behind the man in the suit, the sidewalk already gathered, voices folding together like a crowd rising after the first trumpet. Dorothy realized, with a slow, strange certainty, that whatever this summer was, miracle, coincidence, or something else, nothing would be the same after tomorrow. She closed the door, but the knock came again. By mid-July the backyard had become a map of wishes and warnings. The sidewalk outside Dorothy's house was a pulsing line of people with stories, a son clutching a faded photograph asking for one more chance to speak with his dying father, a woman with arthritis whose fingers had stiffened so long she could no longer thread a needle, a boy who had been lost to drugs and now wanted to say sorry. Some came with the reverence of parishioners, others came with the fierce hunger of the desperate. A handful came with cameras and notepads and the sharp, clinical curiosity of reporters who knew how to turn human wonder into a segment that fit neatly between commercials. Brooksville became a place where ordinary kindness and raw business sense tangled in the heat. The diner on Main offered prayer pie for a week and then quietly changed the name back when a regular shook his head. A woman named Gloria, who mopped the floors at St. Michael's, left a bouquet of store-bought roses by the curb and prayed for the little girl who had stopped speaking and then began to speak as if someone else lent her words, somewhere between hope and commerce. The town's long, even rhythm started to quicken. Not everyone was patient with the quickening. Tensions rose as outsiders rolled through, bringing microphones and hearts expectant as birds. There was talk at the county office of setting up barriers and permits. There were angry phone calls and blunt op-eds. Some called it a media circus, some called it God. The most dangerous thing in small towns is how fast a rumor can harden into a cause. The statue, a small, plaster Mary with paint worn soft at the hands, bought for a wedding anniversary, became a mirror in which Brooksville saw its better angels and its worst calculations. Then the first real wound happened. It was late on a Thursday, after the last of the visitors had drifted away. Dorothy had gone to bed with the quiet birdsong of relief in the house because Emma had slept the way children do when their dreams are finally theirs. At 2:30 a.m., something heavy struck the back fence like a fist. Dorothy woke, heart banging against bone, and pulled a robe over her pajamas. She peered through the window and saw two silhouettes leave the yard in a lumbering scramble. They were teenagers, lanky and half laughing, carrying the bleached shadow of a beer can and the loud, careless bravado of people who believe consequences are for other people. In the morning the statue was on its side. The head had a hairline crack and a smear of green paint across its robe. Someone had kicked up dirt into the flower bed and scrawled with a shoe on the pavers, "Fake." The sight of it made the whole town tilt. Dorothy felt a coldness she could not name, a hollowing in the place where tenderness lives. She knelt in the dirt and gathered the fallen statue into her arms like one would gather a child who had scraped a knee. News spread faster than grief. People arrived with rags and prayers. Father Miguel, the priest from St. Michael's, an earnest man with silver in his beard, came with a bag of tools and a face like someone trying to hold a sermon in his eyes. He gathered those who would listen and spoke in a voice that was not a triumph but a plea. "We must be charitable," he said. "We must not make idols of things, but we also must care for one another. We do not know what this is, but we owe one another respect." Not everyone accepted Father Miguel's gentle framing. A small, furious faction, people who had felt slighted, cheated, or simply skeptical, began to organize in whispers. The teenagers who'd done the damage were called to account. A local blog named them vandals and posted their blurred faces. Families chose sides. Some of the teenagers' parents offered apologies and repair money. Others defended a culture of careless youth who had never learned better. What followed was a strange muddle of prayer vigils and a protest. A woman who'd first come for her mother's healing organized a candlelight vigil. People from the church, from the barber shop, from the hospital, and from the hardware store brought their candles and their rosaries and stood in the dark, singing old hymns in voices that cracked like ice on a pond. Across the street, a noisy group of online documentarians set up a live stream and shouted about exploitation. The town was split between the lamplight and the screen light, and the air hummed with the friction. In the middle of it all, Emma went on sitting in the garden, watching the grown-up weather change like a child watches clouds. She said nothing for days. When she did speak it was in a voice the town hung on like a bargain. "Mary said sorry," Emma told Dorothy once, looking up like a child who had absorbed an adult's understanding through some unseen sieve. "She said she forgives." People wept in the street when they heard that. Some took it as proof, others took it as how children will soothe what adults cannot bear. Dorothy, who had learned to brace herself for the slings and arrows of small-town opinion, felt the line between her interior life and public life thinning. She kept thinking of Harold and the cigar tin, of how the statue had come into the yard on a day with fewer cars and simpler debts. She felt the house and its garden becoming an altar to something larger than a family's memories. The county inspector came. Social services called more than once, worried about the safety of a 2-year-old with a crowd outside her gate. There were polite legal letters, from someone claiming to be Rick Castellanos' associate, asking for meetings and opportunities. Dorothy answered none. The town lawyer came to advise her on liability and image rights and how to write a simple refusal that might hold. You don't have to explain, he said, you don't have to justify what's yours. Father Miguel's sermons took on a tone of weary care. He spoke about faith as a thing that sometimes shows up in broken, ordinary places. He listened to people whose lives had been changed and to people who had been frightened. At the barber shop, men who had never spoken about their souls talked about how something had made them cry on their way home. On the other side of town, a woman who ran a thrift store declared the statue a vessel, and placed a makeshift guest book there, signed by hands that smelled of motor oil and perfumed candles alike. History, too, reached its hand into the present. Old Mrs. Larkin, who remembered the town before Dorothy's house had a mailbox, said she'd once heard of a traveling sister in 1921 who'd stopped in a town nearby and tended to the sick. They said she left behind a small statue like that one. Mrs. Larkin whispered, lowering her voice as if history itself were private property. She recounted a story of a chest of seed sown in drought in a barn that saved a family. Whether the details were exact mattered less than how people wanted them to fit together, longing and narrative fastening into a neat pattern. Then came a report that made even the skeptics tighten their faces. At 3 churches across 2 counties, old stories of inexplicable kindnesses resurfaced when the local historian dug through brittle newspapers. An elderly woman in Dade City remembered a mournful stranger singing children to sleep 50 years ago. These threads, pulled and retied, made the town feel less alone when it had its back to the wall and more like part of a long line of small miracles and larger misunderstandings. There were also scientific voices. Dr. Patricia Williams, the pediatrician who had first assessed Emma, wrote a careful note for a local paper. She described what she called a therapeutic breakthrough. Sometimes, children emerging from trauma latch onto stories or routines that allow them to speak again. She urged compassion and care over spectacle. A psychology professor from the university offered a measured explanation about suggestibility and the way communities construct meaning. These voices, measured and sober, did nothing to quiet the vigil candles or the video feeds. They simply made the chorus more complicated. As the town's attention angled toward a kind of fever, the pressures closed in on Dorothy. A representative from social services arrived with a tablet of forms and a soft voice. We're concerned about Emma's exposure to large crowds, she said. It was framed politely, with concern for a child's well-being, but Dorothy heard in it a threat. Remove the child to a place where the news crews couldn't reach her, where the crowds couldn't press like storm flocks. Dorothy wondered for the first time how to protect a child who had once been silent and was now a town's oracle. She found herself speaking in a voice that surprised her. Firm, clear. Emma stays with me, she said. She is a child, that is enough. The night before what would have been a Sunday blessing, a large, organized event proposed by half the town and opposed by the other half, Dorothy stood on the porch and watched the street. There were groups making plans and others making placards. A man in a suit who smelled faintly of cologne and contract paper had left a business card on the porch table with an invitation she had not accepted. Father Miguel had called to ask for a simple prayer service, not a spectacle. Social services had suggested a professional assessment. The town owner of the hardware store offered to set up portable lights and barricades for people's safety. Everything became a negotiation over the shape of what was happening. Late that night Dorothy put Emma to sleep and found herself fingering the seam where the statue's head met its shoulders. The crack from the earlier attack had been glued, patched, painted with a steadier hand than hers. She imagined Harold's weathered fingers, the cigar tin coins, the way men love the small rituals that make life bearable. She could have let the statue be hauled away for repair, hidden in a shed until the heat cooled. She could have moved Emma to a place where the world's noise was a distant tide, or she could let whatever it was be what it had been for those 3 impossible weeks. A locus where people's hopes took shape and sometimes, a thing changed. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played a prayer in Spanish, then a country song, then a late-night host calling listeners to tell their tales. The air smelled of cut grass and something like waiting. Dorothy closed her eyes and prayed the only prayer she could, not for miracles on command, but for the child in her house to be safe and small and allowed the fragile time children require. She walked to the garden one last time before sleep, and the statue's face, patched as it was, held a steady, expressionless peace. Dorothy touched the cool plaster, and for a heartbeat she thought she felt warmth, like a hand returning her touch. The hairs rose on the back of her neck. She thought of the teenagers and the beers and the whispered threats. She thought of the people who had laughed and those who had cried. On Sunday morning the town would gather. The paper had printed the announcement in bold, a day of blessing. People would bring blankets and rosaries, words and cameras. Some would come to be healed, some to be seen, some to prove a point. Even in the smallness of Brooksville, big things can collide. grief, commerce, faith, and legal forms. Dorothy turned back to the house, the shape of the yard stitching itself to the shape of her life. She was exhausted and afraid, and beneath those two truths ran a thin thread of something that looked like courage. She would stand at the gate, she would decide, in that very moment, whether a child who had been lost to silence should be set on a stage for the world, or kept in the quiet where children become children again. She unlocked the back gate just once more before the sunrise and stepped out into the garden. The plinth where the statue stood was empty. Her hand tightened on air where plaster used to be. There was a smear of soil on the stones leading away toward the old sycamore, and then, footprints, small, neat, and fading, they led across the yard and stopped abruptly at the place where the fence met the neighbor's property. A single scrap of paper lay on the plinth, a child's drawing of a figure in blue, and across it, in a handwriting that might have been hurried, a single line: "She goes where she is needed most." Dorothy's breath left her like a sigh. The town's songs and shouts began to rise beyond the hedges. She could hear the distant hum of cars, and the muted thud of a television in a living room 2 doors down where someone had already switched on the weather. The day was breaking, people were coming. Dorothy pressed the scrap to her palm and felt the electric, thin flavor of a decision pressing at the edges of the ordinary. She could lock the gate, close the curtains, call the police for theft. She could call Father Miguel and tell him the statue had been stolen and ask him to stand between the town and whatever came next. Or she could follow the footprints. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. The sound of the town rising was a wind that wanted a sail. She took a step toward the gate, then another, and in that instant the world tilted toward a choice that would not allow her to stay small. Dorothy folded the crooked scrap of paper and slid it into her pocket like a promise she wasn't ready to make out loud. The small footprints that had led away from the plinth seemed to dissolve where the grass met the road. By the time the first cars pulled up and voices rose beyond hedges, she had made a single choice. She would follow, quietly, as far as the trail took her. She walked down the block in slippers and a tired cardigan. The morning sun pressing at the hem of her skirt. On the porch of the yellow house, Carmen was already sweeping. She didn't look surprised to see Dorothy. Instead she held out a little glass jar of mint tea, still warm. "I found it where my mailbox used to be," she said simply, and handed Dorothy a cup. "It was there last night when I went to check the front. I don't know who would do such a thing, but I woke up strong this morning." Her voice had that low, certain tone people get after. Something impossible has steadied them. Dorothy kept walking. The footprints, if they were footprints at all, reappeared at the corner and then vanished near the feed store. An old man named Earl, who ran the bait and tackle, paused when he saw her. He tipped his hat in that slow, respectful way. "Saw you leave the house," he said. "Figured maybe you were chasing gossip." He gave a small laugh that fell off the edge of the sentence. "No, ma'am, maybe not gossip. I saw the statue last night." He didn't wait for Dorothy to ask. "Placed it on my porch swing," he said. "Left a note about rain, said something about a boy coming into the shop that would need hope." Next morning, a kid walked in with his dad. Looked lost, like a boat without oars. He left with a fishing pole grandma had hidden for a grandson. Said it'd be his first cast. Earl shrugged. "It's only a statue, Mrs. Henderson, but I got to see a boy smile. That's real." The strange part wasn't that the statue seemed to move. The strangest part was how people spoke about it, without malice, almost as if they were sharing a recipe. They found it in garden sheds, on stoops, tied to porch railings with a note folded beneath. "She goes where she is needed most." Some found it near bedsides of lonely people who claimed to smell perfume they hadn't smelled since a lover died. Others found it propped on tables where families were arguing, and the arguing softened into whispers and then into apologies. No one confessed to stealing it. No one declared they had orchestrated a show. The story that spread wasn't of a theft but of a kindness that would not be owned. The press would later call it the traveling statue. Social feeds tried to pin it down with time stamps and shaky video. Some people said men had been seen carrying it in the dead of night. Others insisted it moved on its own, as if the statue had legs and will. The county searched for suspects. The police took reports, but in the intervals between questions, good things kept happening. Dorothy watched all of it with the look of a woman who had just learned that her life could be vast and small at the same time. She thought of Harold and how he'd taught her to plant bulbs in winter so spring would surprise them. She thought of the cigar tin and the way couples make vows in actions rather than words. She walked from house to house, countertop to porch, whisper to whisper, and listened to people stitch their stories back together. Grudges softened. Food was shared, long-term. Arguments took pauses. A man who had been estranged from his sister for years found the chance, brought by a sleepless night and a statue on his step, to say 2 sentences and then listen. 2 sentences, Dorothy thought, sometimes that's all people need. Word reached St. Michael's, and Father Miguel called a meeting. He did not preach about miracles in sweeping terms. He spoke of charity and mystery, of the difference between worship and gratitude. The vestry decided not to claim the statue as parish property. They would, instead, keep a rota of volunteers to care for it if it came to the church, and a discreet journal where people could write what had happened to them. "If this thing travels," Father Miguel said, "let it be a traveling kindness and not a traveling commodity." That evening the statue was placed on the steps of the hospital where a nurse had found it under the ambulance bay. A man in one of the rooms woke to see his lost mother's face looking calm on the bedside table. He took the statue's tiny hand in both his own and said, "Thank you," without thinking. He was the kind of man who didn't say such things easily and then said them so badly that afterwards he laughed with shock. He hadn't cried yet, but that night he slept. The nurse, in an apron splattered with the day's work, told the story to her sisters. The sisters told it to their friends. The statue moved like a pebble rolled into a pond, concentric and impossible to ignore. Still, the town's edges were not all softened. A faction of skeptics kept pointing fingers at opportunists. The events company man, Rick Castellanos, tried again to arrange a central experience, a controlled pilgrimage with wristbands and paid parking. The town lawyer sent Dorothy a letter, impersonal and polite, suggesting that if the statue's presence continued to cause crowds and safety concerns, they might need to pursue legal remedies to protect the child. Social services kept a steady, watchful eye. News vans camped at the library. For every softened heart, there was another person angrier than before. It was in the middle of that noise that Dorothy made the most personal decision of her life. She called a meeting at the church, a quiet Sunday afternoon without a press release or a placard. People came because they wanted to speak or listen. Emma played in a corner with a set of wooden blocks as if she were the least important person in a room full of people whose lives had tilted. When Dorothy spoke, her voice trembled but held. She said she didn't know what had moved the statue. She said she didn't pretend to understand whether it was a miracle or a string of gracious acts stitched together by neighbors, but she did know what it had done. It had brought people back to each other. It had, in small ways, mended things. She asked the room a question, simple and quiet: if we are to have anything like this, shall it belong to us all, not to one person, or one company, or one camera, but to the town? Shall we promise to protect what made us tender, not sell it? The room answered with a long exhale and then with hands raised in a way the church had not seen since baptisms. People volunteered, a committee formed, a rota was written on a sheet of paper. They would not try to monetize the statue. Instead, they would make a system so families in need might find it when they needed it, quietly, without spectacle. They called it informally, the Circle, a group of volunteers who would place the statue where it might do some good and keep it safe when it was not needed. Dorothy handed the first watch to Father Miguel. He accepted with a bow so small and private it felt like a benediction. The agreement was imperfect and messy, as all good things are. Some people grumbled about who decided who needed the statue, others worried about being liars for mercy, but the larger part of the town wanted the Circle to be about care, not conquest. In the weeks that followed, the statue's visits became organized in a way that kept its mystery intact. Sometimes it would appear at a hospice for the elderly. Once it sat on a living room table as a dying man took his last breaths and the house hummed with the soft prayers of relatives counting blessings. Another time, it watched over a teenage mother deciding whether to keep the child she carried. She named the baby after her own mother and later held a small party in the park. Each story gathered into the town like grain into a bin. People still had doubts, and the news vans still drove through, but the heat cooled. Brooksville settled again into a slower rhythm, like a clock that had been wound too tightly and then eased. As for Emma, she grew. The summer that had broken like glass became a distant shape. The 2-year-old who had once spoken in long, clear sentences to a statue learned, with the gentle care of preschool and playdates, to test her own voice. She learned to ride a tricycle. She learned the names of her teachers. She sometimes paused at the garden window and watched the statue on the church steps, a small figure of plaster and paint. Dorothy would watch Emma watch, and then the child would go off to her blocks or her cartoons. Once, when Dorothy asked if she missed Mary, Emma only glanced over and said, she had a lot to do. Dorothy put her hand on the child's head and felt the steady, ordinary weight of hair. There was nothing dramatic in Emma's answer. It was as if the child had taken something large and made it small enough to carry. That smallness was healing in itself. Years later, when journalists wrote about Brooksville, they framed it with neat lines about faith and spectacle and viral moments. The best stories were the intimate ones: the boy who caught his first fish, the sister who finally sat down with her brother, the nurse who found a patient finally sleeping through the night. The statue did not perform miracles on demand. It did not answer every prayer. It did, however, keep surfacing in places where people were kind enough to accept a little help. Whether it moved on its own or by human hands, nobody could say definitively, the town came to prefer the mystery to the certainty. Dorothy's life returned to a quieter arc. She tended the flower bed around the empty plinth in the backyard because she liked the ritual of it and because it reminded her that some things, the living ones, needed hands to keep them. She told the story, sometimes, in the diner, with the rasp of age in her voice and the soft, wide eyes of someone who had been present for something that mattered. She never sold the tale or used it to build a platform. Instead, when asked what she believed, she would say, "I believe in small mercies. I believe people will surprise you when they are asked to be kind." On an ordinary October afternoon, some years after that first hot June, Dorothy sat on the porch with Emma, who was now taller, hair in a loose braid, and a child with a way of looking at people as if they were stories she hadn't yet read. A woman with a stroller paused at their gate and told Dorothy, with the kind of voice that holds many years in it, that her mother had been in the hospital and that a small statue had been placed near the bed at night. The mother had smelled her husband's cologne in the dark and slept peacefully for the first time in months. There would be no front page for this, no camera lights, just a stool with a small plaster figure and two people who slept. Dorothy thought of all the ways the town had been bent and then straightened. She thought of the teenagers who had once broken a statue and of how the same hands had later kneaded bread for a newcomer. She thought of Harold's cigar tin, of love gone and love returned in other forms. She pressed her palms on the porch rail and looked over at the empty plinth where the statue had once stood. The garden smelled of cut grass and magnolia. The world, she decided, had not been cleaved into the miraculous and the mundane. Rather, the miraculous had quietly slipped into the mundane and made it holy. She had no definitive answer to whether the Virgin Mary had ever spoken to Emma. Maybe she had, maybe the voices were a child's recovery made visible, maybe it was a string of brave neighbors. Whatever the origin, the outcome had been real, a traumatized child regaining speech and trust, a town relearning to care for one another, arguments that softened into shared meals. That, to Dorothy, was the sort of miracle one could bank on because it required people's hands. On the porch, with the sun low and the world making its familiar sounds, Dorothy looked at Emma and said, "Thank you for teaching me to keep the flowers." Emma rolled her eyes the way children do and threw a laugh into the air. They both watched the lawn until a breeze came and moved the blades of grass like small flags. The statue's mystery remained, like a soft bruise of wonder on the town's memory. It never made a show of itself again. It did not have to. People told the story in quiet, and it spread in the way small things do, by being remembered at the right moment when someone needed to hear it. If this story touched you, if it warmed you or made you wonder, please leave a like and subscribe so you won't miss the next tale where ordinary hearts meet the unexplainable. Share it with someone who needs a small sign of hope. Thank you for listening, for holding your breath with us, and for believing, if only for a moment, that kindness can move like a mystery and change a life.